Well, welcome back to another video. This time, by popular demand, it is the Jaguar XJ. A lot of you love the XJ, you've messaged in to say when you're going to do the XJ generational video, and I've said the same thing, that actually an XJ is a real favourite car of mine. It's kind of saving it a little bit because whenever I do these videos there's a lot to remember, but also I want to get the little bit of detail. I want to get the tiny little details that you might not get in other videos, and I want to get it right. Throughout its lifespan, I'm going to describe it as an S-Class competitor. The market may feel differently, you may feel differently, but that's kind of how Jaguar always intended it to be. The XJ40 model, I'm not going to refer to it as an XJ40 throughout the guide. I probably will mention it once or twice, but for continuity, from beginning to end, I'm just going to call it the XJ. So what happens, if you're not aware, is that Jaguar released the XJ model. They do 25, well actually they don't do 24 years, they do something like 20 years of production. They keep the Series 3 going with a 12-cylinder engine, but release an XJ40, which is then supposed to replace the XJ, while still selling the last few XJs, and then the XJ40 is actually slightly smaller, but then sort of stretched a little bit, and interior space is sort of pinched and then given back, and then really it sort of extends it through the 90s until it gets to the point where it becomes the XJ again. So to get through that awkward segment, I'll probably call it the XJ40 a few times, but as far as I see it, Jaguar have a great history of basically never naming their cars the same thing, and so it's just easiest for this guide if I just call it an XJ all the way along. You'll have to forgive me if you are particularly sensitive to that and you want it called exactly what it should be. I'm just going to keep it simple. So let's start off where we need to start, which is 1968. But who would I be to not give the Jaguar 420 a quick mention, which is sort of the recognised predecessor to this car, runs for about 5 years before the XJ comes in, and then sort of hands over the reins and the XJ comes in and has the XK engine as it's branded. So you can have that in a 2.6, a 4.2, and then there's a 5.3 litre V12. Now, for the Series 1, 2 and 3, they're essentially the same vehicle with alterations made for the 2 and then the 3. And what I'm going to say for all of this generation, because I don't want to spend too much time on it, being that they're classic vehicles, is that any classic vehicle, when I worked in classic cars, you have to judge them by their condition, their specification at the time, and that history that they've had, ownership, and how they've been cared for throughout their life. That makes it really difficult, because the one to buy is always going to be a 12-cylinder, really, isn't it? I make that comment flippantly, of course, because the inline 6 has got a good reputation. It's the engine that a lot of people like, and it has a bit more history to it than the V12 had. However, the opportunity to own a classic car with a V12 is probably not long for this world, and the last V12s have pretty much gone now from production, and so everything that you would want this size vehicle with a V12 is now going to be a used purchase, and the majority of them are now slipping into that sort of modern classic territory, which is where you sort of put a 15 to a 30-year-old car before it really goes into the sort of classics or historic vehicle. For most countries, I think 40 years, the UK is 40 years, we then give it a historic title. Doesn't have to be annually checked anymore, doesn't have to be taxed or anything like that. It's a historic vehicle, and that's what we're really dealing with here along the Series 1 and 2. The 3 does stretch into the point where it still needs to be kept road compliant and road worthy, which, depending on where you are in the UK specifically, will be a bit of a challenge. But in the Series 1, the ones that I have seen previously, and I'm trying to think actually the ones I saw with a 12-cylinder, and I think I saw one at a show quite a while back. The ones that seem to have made it this far, partially because they were in from the inception. So I think it's 72 is when the 12-cylinder comes in, whereas you sort of 68, 69, 70, 71, and then in 72 are all inline 6s. So there are more inline 6s around. There's around 83,000 XJs made in this first generation, this first series. Looking at the ones that I saw, the 2.8s, they seem to have lived a life. I think a lot of them were bought initially because they were possibly all someone needed, or they had to go and do a job. And so buying with a bigger engine, less fuel efficiency, maybe that wasn't the pick, especially because we're going into a time in history of a fuel crisis and fuel prices going up across the world. So I think this is where sort of the 4.2 got a little bit less favour because of that. However, looking at the market as it was a few years back when I worked in it, the 4.2 still had a pretty strong following. And although people would have a look at a 2.8, if you had a 4.2, that was kind of the pick to have. A little bit more power, a little bit more redundancy built into it, just that larger engine could take a little bit more. And probably the bigger factor in all this was the care that owners have given it. If they had a 4.2, they seem to have just, throughout its years, I don't know whether it needed more early on and then they just spent the money, or whether it just fell into the right hands. I'm not saying that all the 2.8s wouldn't have, but yeah, that's kind of how things went. The 12, so the 12 cylinder, this is going to be costliest to buy, costliest to buy in most scenarios actually. Again, because we're talking about an era of cars built in the sort of 60s and 70s, I would buy on condition in the Series 1 and in the Series 2. I'll come on to the Series 2 in just a second. But instead of, as we get a bit later on, and I'm going to be able to say, well, this engine offers you this engine offers you that. At this point, it's going to be, if you can find one that's had a really good restoration, does it matter on the engine? 4.2 is going to feel able to keep you up with modern traffic that bit easier. A 12 cylinder will be an experience, and the 2.8, that will do a job, but any of them that have had that restoration work done, and I think having seen the market, that will be pulling a little bit more into the 4.2. Doesn't mean the 2.8 won't get some love, but I think it will be pulling more into the 4.2. Let's move on to the Series 2. And so a 6-year run on the Series 2, 1973 to 1979. We add a 3.4 engine in here, which I'm just going to go out at the very start of it and get a 3.4. I'd go for a 3.4. New engine comes in. It fits really nicely in the lineup. 2.8 then I think loses a little bit of sales from this. People drift a little bit more towards that 3.4. I've driven that 3.4 actually in a couple of Jaguars. I'm trying to recall them off the top of my head. I won't because I'll waste too much time on the video. But that 3.4 engine, it still today, it's just sort of there with modern traffic. You're not feeling like you're really sort of gunning it. And if you want to really gun it, you can, because there isn't so much power that before you know it, you're doing illegal speeds. It's an interesting engine to have in this type of vehicle because while suspension is still set up to be comfort, 3.4 comes in and it just gives a little bit more of an urge to the XJ. So 2.8, 3.4, 4.2, the 12 cylinder's still there. For the 12 cylinder in this second generation, we start to add in electric fuel injection. This is market dependent. In the US, you get a different system to what UK, European market, and I think the Aussies, I think you get the UK system as well. So I think it's just the US. And this is probably why for this Series 2, Series 3, and I think in the XJ40s, the US, for emissions rules and for different part supply and everything else, for the next 20 years is going to get different part supply in areas which, whenever I see a lot of people sort of saying, oh, these old Jags, they always break down, blah, blah. Yep, some of them are in the UK, but there's a lot of good support in the UK. Really, I see a lot of it in the US. And I think that might be partially because it's working with a system that the original Jaguar designers were not initially at the drawing board with. They're sort of adding in these bits later. Bit of part supply, bit of specialists. There's some really good Jaguar specialists in the US. And of course, if you go to one of them, then you probably shouldn't have too much of a problem. They'll know exactly what you've got and how to get around the issues. But just something to be aware of. So the pick, yeah, I'd probably look at 3.4 or, again, 12 cylinder. I think in any of these generations, if you can get a 12 cylinder, then wow. I didn't give this a mention in the first series, so let's talk about it in the second series, and it's the Sovereign model. Now, throughout the XJ's lifespan, I'm just trying to rattle my head, I'm pretty sure even the last, maybe not the very, very last generation does get a Sovereign. I'm trying to remember. I know it gets a Sentinel, it gets an armoured one, but I don't know if the last one actually does. I'll have to check that before I make the last bit of the video. But for every other generation, until we get to the very last one, it is Sovereign models. The Sovereign model is that top specification, and on the used market will require a premium. Today, it has some kudos at the classic shows to have a Sovereign. Because of what it's adding in for the time, it was something a little bit, I don't want to call it special, but it was something notable. Today, it's more the kudos of having a Sovereign. You know, at the end of the day, we live in a world where people are driving electric Volkswagens around with heated steering wheels, heated seats that can just dance and everything else. So, you know, the idea of specification, you've got to really be in the classic world and be an enthusiast of it to care for the minor differences. Now, of course, there are a lot of people that do, and I'm not saying you shouldn't. I just think if this is going to be a classic car that you are buying, maybe you want to keep it in the garage and then use it, you know, 10 times a year, then something like a Sovereign. If you want something that you're going to take away, weekend holidays, maybe a trip abroad or a long distance journey to another state, if you want something that you could choose on a sunny Thursday to take to work instead of using the company vehicle or whatever else you may have on the driveway, if it's that type of vehicle, I probably would just drift towards having a 3.4, 4.2, maybe a 12-cylinder, but I wouldn't be so bothered about having a Sovereign. It's just one of those ideas of if it's going to be in the classic shows a lot, then going for no compromise is the best one you can find. If it's going to be something you want to actually drive, I would still be looking at condition, history, and the current owner. And even the classic car world, I think, if I'm honest, I think it got a little bit corrupted 10-ish years ago with this idea that everything can make money. So you don't buy it on passion so much anymore. You just buy it and then in 10 years you sell it and you'll make some money. Classic cars, especially in this sort of size and generation of vehicle, it's not really about that. You've got to be passionate about the vehicle, and maybe you're buying it because someone in your family owned one, because an old one that you know comes up for sale, or because you've still got one and you just want to keep it going. Those are the reasons to own these, and I think as long as you have it with that mindset, you're not going to be that disappointed. If you're buying an XJ Series 1, Series 2, and you think, oh, I'll get a 12-cylinder because it'll be worth double the money in 10 years, I'd be cautious about making that assumption, especially because the maintenance that it's going to need over the next 10 years, if you're using it for more than just sunny day, take it for a picnic, take it to the classic show, take it to a stately home or something, and then that's it, it sits in the garage. It's really difficult because you won't be putting the mileage on it in that way. However, cars like to be driven, and especially one of the things I used to see in the classic car world, 70s cars, 80s cars, I mean, we can go right up to today, but especially those 70s, 80s cars, they want to be driven. And if you don't drive them, you end up having more issues, I'd say, on average. This isn't every case, but you seem to have more issues than you do if you actually are taking them out regularly. It's an interesting one. I think it's just cars are designed to be driven, not be sort of bubble wrapped up and, you know, bought as an investment purchase. Of course, if you're buying something that's £1 million and is a supercar, then you're going to pay $10,000 on a service each year just to keep it looking nice. So it doesn't matter so much whether you drive it or not. But these, you know, if you want to have something that's a good driver, I'd just go for a 3.4, find a few nice extras on it, but buy it on condition and the previous owner. Let's move on to the Series 3. And this is the last lot of the first generation vehicle, 1979. Technically, it stretches all the way to 92, but actually it's about 86, 88 that we're going to go into the XJ40 in a second. However, this is the model that gets a Daimler. So all the generations, second generation definitely does, third, I think the first does as well. They get the Daimler equivalent. So Daimler still exists as a brand, so you can have a Jaguar or you can have a Daimler. It's an odd one on the classic car world, because if you're really into this era of cars, which unfortunately I think there is a sort of slip away from this era of cars. This just happens with time. The next generation comes along and they're not necessarily as interested in the classics of the generation before them. However, these big Jags, they do have a little bit of a crossover with generations. People seem to just love them. A bit less depending on their age, which is really good if you own one and if you buy one. But interestingly, they have the Vanden Plas model. And the Vandenpla in my head looks, well, I'll just show you a picture. This is what it looks like to me. And I think that's from years of watching sort of classic car shows. If you're in the UK, actually, if you're anywhere in the world, you probably can get hold of a show called Bangers and Cash, which is a really good, interesting classic car show. And Vandenpla is just stuck in my head as it looks like that, not a specification of a Daimler of an XJ. But there is that one, and it sounds quite fancy, doesn't it? Oh, what do you drive? Well, I have a Sovereign Vandenpla. I'd probably buy one just for the name. And then when you sort of pull the rug off the top of it or whatever you're covering it with, someone will go, yeah, it looks like a Jag. They also do the 6.6 on the Daimler. And then you have a little bit more limited engines. So the smallest engine's gone, 3.4, 4.2 again, 12 cylinder now, fuel injected for the whole run. I probably missed mentioning about the coupe model on the second series, or the Series 2, sorry. We don't get that in the Series 3. So it's a very short run of vehicles. You get Series 1, Series 2, Series 2 with a coupe model, and then Series 3 sort of deletes the coupe model. Coupe models, if you want them, by the way, are about 10,000 of them were made, just shy of that. In some ways, very attractive purchase, but expect to have a big maintenance bill with them because they've lived a life. The coupe ones from their inception, really, in most cases, from what I saw. But anyway, on with the Series 3, this is where it's been out long enough. If you look across its lifespan, it's been out long enough now as a car that Jaguar, along the way, they've been able to do the little refinements that customer feedback has given them. And so while there is Sovereign model and there is the Daimler versions, this, of all of them, out of the 1, 2 and 3, the series, I'd look at a 3. I'd try and get a 12 cylinder, but I think the premium on them is just a little bit too sharp at the moment, and that will possibly soften in time. I don't know. It's so difficult with a 12 cylinder because you can't buy 12 cylinders, as I mentioned earlier, really on the new market anymore. So there is an element of possibly it will just hold where it is now. Whereas if you look at something like 4.2, then again, bit of an increase in power, bit of an increase in sort of the modernisation of how the engine runs in an old chassis by this point, but one that's been sort of adjusted and modified, and feedback has been given on it. And in my head, worth thinking about. But if it's one you actually want to be driving and polishing up and loving, buy on condition, but something like the 4.2 or the 3.4 will probably see you, for most scenarios, a little bit happier. And if it's something you want people to care about on the road, those cars, for the majority of the public today, are going to be just as interesting, if you want to put it that way, as having something like a high-spec Daimler or having a Sovereign model. Let's move on to the next generation. It's the XJ40, but the second version, if you like, the second sort of proper body shell that the XJ gets. So 1986 rolls up, and a car that Jaguar have been wanting to build for, I think, about 15 years at this point. I think the first design sketches were done very early 70s. There's the oil crisis I mentioned. There's issues with British Leyland. There's a whole host of problems that just delay and delay and delay the XJ40's arrival. And I think, unfortunately, that's... Jaguar have made a few mistakes across their history, but they've made a few absolute corking choices as well. And so they've sort of balanced themselves off in history, if you like. And one of the problems that they have faced that was not their fault was simply a case of economy, worldwide events, and internal infighting around the companies that owned them or had a financial interest to get stuff done within Jaguar, but in ever increasingly difficult ways, because Jaguar really needed to move in one direction and they needed to do it faster, mainly because their competitors were doing that. And so that's what we see with the rise of Mercedes at this point, and the rise of BMW in really capturing this segment of the market, whilst Jaguar are just a little bit behind at this point. We're going to see when the X300 version of this car comes out, and then the X308, Jaguar really start to ramp up the pace and they start to catch up. But the XJ40 is a little bit of a difficult one. It's just taken so long to arrive. Arrives with some 6-cylinder engines and does the job. They reintroduce a V12, they reintroduce a 6.6 on the on the Daimler model, and they've saved about 25. It's 25%. It's either 25% or 25%. They've changed the production. There's a 25% change in how they do things. So a quarter of the way all things are manufactured for that car is completely different to the car before. They're just using different techniques, more modern techniques. That's saving weight. It's adding stiffness to the chassis, which is improving its driving dynamics. And that is really where Jaguar were trying to sort of corner this bit of the market. We're saying, we made the E-Type. We are here to provide you that big luxury vehicle that you can still drive when you need to. Unfortunately, BMW are trying to do the same thing with the 7 Series, and they're sort of saying, look, you may want the S-Class for luxury. What about if you want luxury and you want to be able to drive your family a little bit quick down an alpine road? Jaguar just at this point were a little bit behind the curve. And we see that within the XJ40's production, this era, this sort of run up to 94, it's not to say they're bad cars, but they have been a little bit underappreciated in the classic world, and it makes them difficult for you to find the ones that will really stand out to you, because at times when they may have needed big bills paying, engine overhauls, chassis work, body refinishing, repainting, things like this, owners may have just been that little bit more reluctant than they would have been if this car had arrived maybe 5 or 6 years earlier and really captured a little bit more of the market and got themselves a little bit ahead of the Germans, which unfortunately they just didn't manage to do. Does it mean it's a bad car? Absolutely not. Does it mean you can get a straight 6 AJ6 engine in it and enjoy it? Absolutely it does. And of all of them, possibly you can get yourself, I don't want to call it that you would get a bargain here and not elsewhere, but they're at that age and that manufacturing process where they may not need, if they have been a little bit neglected, not a lot, but a little bit neglected, they may not need sort of complete overhauls to get them back into good shape. And a lot of people look at old cars, much older cars, 60s, 70s cars, and think, oh, I can do it all in my shed, fantastic. The truth is, I've seen those cars. I've seen them when they come onto the market and someone said, oh, well, I bought a 70s one and I've done it all myself. And you look at it and you think, you started with a really bad car. And when you start with something that's really bad, you kind of need that workshop, that expertise that comes with really big builds. And the cars aren't worth the money when they're finished. And so, I hate to be critical of the classic car market like this. I've seen it, and I've interviewed owners when they're selling their cars, taken down all details from them, and I've kind of got this story that makes the car seem like something that I can see that it isn't. Not unless it's sort of had this complete nut and bolt restore overhaul and then been driven 10 laps of Europe without being washed ever since, because there's just always more that needs to be done. So I would just be a little bit cautious. If you're buying one of these and you think to yourself, oh, well, it'll be a cheap fix and I'll get it. More so, yes, than the 1, 2 and 3 in some respects. But because of the difference in design and the more modern aspects of design, as long as those bits are good, then you probably will have jobs you can do at home. But if those parts have problems, you need really good vehicle refinishers who are going to get this car back to its shape. And because of the market for them isn't quite that strong enough, it's going to be hard to buy those cars because people will either want a ton of money for them, way above their market value, or, and I did see this once, a guy who'd done a complete, just incredible job of a Jag. Trying to remember, it was a 3.4. But, I mean, he was losing nigh on £35,000. He was just completely swallowing that. He loved the car, he'd done a ton of work on it, had sentimental value to him, and then it was time for it to go, and someone else was going to get a peach of a car for nowhere near the money that he had spent on it. If you can find one of those, fantastic. The trouble is, in reality, they're going to be few and far between, and it's now going to be a market of, I've spent loads of money, so I want it. And is it worth it, to be honest, with the X300 that we're about to talk about and the 308 after that? Or then going Series 1, 2, 3 where you're into the real classic territory? Don't want to be critical of the XJ40 as it sits here, but it's just, you know, just be a bit cautious if you're looking at this one. But a 12-cylinder that's been well cared for, has great receipts, a really passionate owner, is still going to be a fantastic buy. And the fact you can have the AJ6 on this generation, AJ6 engine, really what you're bringing in is what the 12-cylinder would have had previously, sort of power and dynamic wise, but in a much smaller and lighter package. And that you can actually see a shift within Jaguar here, whereas before it was the gentleman would buy a V12, of course he would, to, you know what, the AJ6, let me go for that. Let me pick that one. That one's the one that does the job and does it well. And do I need 12 cylinders anymore? Doesn't mean you shouldn't have one though. X300 generation. So July 1994, and this is where, from a used point, we start to get really serious. I suppose, from my point, I may be a little bit biased here. As I said, the earlier series cars, the Series 3 especially, that makes me see it, say, yeah, that's an XJ. But I think, as I said, maybe it's an age thing, or maybe it's just I saw some of them in the classic world. They also remind me a little bit of watching Arthur Daly as a young boy when they were doing reruns of whatever that comedy was. I'll put a thing on the bottom here. Many of you probably haven't seen it, but yeah, that's where it kind of runs in my head. But the X300, we really get serious here. AJ16 engine comes in, so you can get that as a it's a 4 litre, a 3.2, and a 4 litre supercharged. And a 4 litre supercharged AJ16, you are motoring. However, there's also a 6 litre V12 for those of you that need to have a V12. Now, there's loads of different names to these. You've got Daimler Century, Daimler 6. I actually had to write a list. I've put it down in front of me here. Daimler 6, Daimler 66, Jaguar XJ Sport, Jaguar XJR, Jaguar Sovereign, Jaguar Vanden Plas. So many versions of this car. And I remember going out to see classic ones of these, especially at car shows, and you'd see a line of XJs. And each one would be different in some way. Someone has got, oh, this is this, and some of them are a bit more obvious. You know, you have an XJR, that's a bit more obvious. A V12 has a few sort of styling cues that you can spot a mile off if you know what to look for. But honestly, it's almost as if Jaguar was selling each one as a tailor-made car to the customer. Like, oh yes, you can have this one, sir. Oh yes, we won't sell another one of those. We'll sell another one, a different one, to the next person. And so when you see them, it's quite funny that you just, I suppose, a little bit of a victim of not that many made it. And I suppose I should mention, this is Ford ownership. Ford ownership comes in and says, you're not doing things how you used to. We need to get all your accounts in order. We need to make money on this. We need to move forward as a brand. And Jaguar needs to become something, because it's kind of just behind the pace of what the Germans are bringing in. It's no longer holding its previous prestige mark as more imported vehicles are coming into Europe. And if you drive one of these, this X300 chassis, it does feel like, I'm not going to say that it feels like a wild jump over an XJ40. I think that's a little bit unfair. But if you get in a Series 3 and a very, very late Series 3, sort of a 90, 91, one of those 12-cylinder ones, or even if you get in, say, like an 85, yeah, and then you get in a 95 X300, they do not feel a decade apart. They feel more like 2 or 3 decades apart. There's just something that's happened to Jaguar in the 90s where they said, you got to get your accounts in order, get yourself moving in the right direction, and it starts to go that way. From the used market side of things, I probably wouldn't get a 3.2, I'd probably get a 4 litre. Is that a little bit of bias of myself coming in? Yes, it is. Looking at them on the used market, as I say, the one thing I always found with used sort of classic, modern classic, is whatever the desirable engine has been over the decade, so within a decade of a car coming out, it will usually have its most desirable engine. So if we go, I'll just talk very shortly about the most recent one. The 3 litre diesel is very, very popular in the most recent XJ to be released, but a 5 litre supercharged one will undoubtedly, in 30 years from now be very, very desirable. And possibly a straight 6 will as well. And the diesel will the diesel makes a very good argument for itself today as an everyday car. When you move it onto the classic market, yeah, it will still have some people, but in 30 years' time, there'll probably be so many regulations that you won't be able to drive it. And so what is the sort of in period popular engine doesn't always remain as you go into the classic market. And after 10, 15 and 20 years, as vehicles start to need big bills paid on them, if people don't have the one with what's sort of becomes the allure of a particular engine, then it falls out of favour and then it's gone. And so, gets scrapped or whatever else, or it gets chopped up for parts. It's the sad reality, unfortunately, of a car's journey, especially a car that's a little bit special. And when I was selling cars back in 2008, you would have been shocked. And I found it very difficult some days when customers would come in with cars that I looked at them and I said, this will probably be a classic in 10 years, you know that. There was a scrappage scheme in the UK in 2008, and if you brought a car in over, I can't remember what it had to be now, I think it had to be over 12 years old, something like that, then you could get a fixed amount, something like £2,000, something, £2,500, maybe a bit more, discount off buying a brand new car. I think the US had like a cash for clunkers thing, similar sort of idea behind it. It was just a silly scheme in many ways, because some cars that were of an age that could be, it may have been 8 years actually, I think it was 8 years old they had to be, so they really didn't have to be that old to be, no, 10 years. It's either 8 years, 10 years or 12 years, I'll put a thing up probably. No, but we scrapped some cars that would definitely be classics today, and we had to. So once they came in, if someone said, yeah, we filled out a form, the government scheme, that was it. The guy came up and he used to pick them up by their roof because they were not going to go back onto the road. And some of the cars, some really nice Jaguars, some BMWs, some Mercedes, you know, the guy's like, so is it you that's got this one with a trade-in? And if you'd had it traded in, you had to go and take it out to the delivery driver. And so, yeah, you'd see it there sat in the corner and you'd think, this car's got another 10, 20 years in it if it finds the right owner. And in 20 years, it could well be a real classic. And then you'd see it get picked up by its roof, put on the back of a trailer and driven off, and you'd know its fate was to come. It was an interesting point in the car market. But because of that, I think the sort of smaller engine of these may not have made it through. And something like a supercharged 4 litre will almost certainly have. So today, 4 litre, supercharged 4 litre is probably where the money is going to go, and where you're going to find the ones that have probably had the most care and the willingness to spend money that you know you're not going to get back on these things, because big service jobs or big repair jobs, you're not getting them when you resell it back. All that money, it's just going to be the steady increase in value if it has it. X308 generation. And here we go. This is the car that Jaguar actually wanted to release. If we're looking at it in a timeline, Jaguar finally get to sort of put in a little bit of their own way, and you get this all aluminium V8 engine, comes in a 3.2 or 4 litre supercharged 4 litre XJR with a Mercedes gearbox in that model with the supercharger, and it really thrusts Jaguar up the rung. You know, from where they've been. It's been a troubled decade, I would say. Early 80s into the 90s, it's been a difficult run for Jaguar to really get the cars they want. Now, some people love those cars, and there's nothing wrong with them from a point of view. If you're passionate for them, you can still enjoy them. But it is, from where Jaguar were with that Series 1 release of an XJ to where they finally get to with the X308, and possibly the X300 as well. That gap in between, you can just tell there's a lot going on. That if things had been different, maybe if accounts had been different, maybe if there hadn't been so much infighting or whatever else had been going on behind the scenes, possibly Jaguar would have been a much more of a sort of prominent global force in this segment of vehicles. However, when we get to the 308, that's where it comes in. So you've got a 6-7 year run of this car arriving into the market, really showing people, you know, okay, well, it's 90, 98 now, 1999. So yeah, 1998. And there's a lot of things happening in the world. There's some world leaders changing, particularly in the UK. So this new Jaguar is going to get to be a prime ministerial vehicle as well. But it still carries on with its sort of sovereign model, with its Daimler, the Jaguar Vandenpla, which I'm still not going to forget, and a Super 8 model comes out as well. So and then the AJ8 or Super 8, something like that. So there's basically, all I'm saying here is that this is kind of where Jaguar finally get to come to market with the product they want, and you can see it. You can see it if you look at the launch of it, the press launch of it, the way they sort of brought in this car. I'm not saying they were not proud about previous generations, but when a bunch of engineers get to finally do what they've been wanting to do for a decade, you can tell there's a little bit more excitement around it. And that has kind of ran through into the used market. So this engine became very, very popular across Jaguar. It's lasted a long time as well, but it kind of deleted a need in some way. Whereas previously you kind of had to spend top money to get the top car, you could in this generation go for something like the mid or entry to mid-spec XJ model and not feel like you've been really shortchanged with it. Partially because of the engine, partially because Jaguar have finally got to do what they want to do, and you can kind of feel that when you get behind the wheel of one. So if there was one that you want to own long term as a bit of a classic vehicle, take it out on the weekends, picnics, classic car shows, stately homes, all that sort of stuff, it'd probably be an X308 for me. That would the one. It's new enough also that from the point of view of maintaining it yourself, there shouldn't be sort of huge problems with it if you buy a good one. But also, it doesn't need a load of computers to run everything. So we're in that really nice sweet spot for DIYers where there's enough modern tech that you can kind of drive it around every day and not be worried, oh, something's going to go wrong and I'm going to need, a whole old school tool set, and I'm possibly dealing with carburetors if you're on the really old stuff. All that's long gone. You've got a much more modern engine, an engine that continues for quite a long time, and you've got a vehicle that, although once you get sort of 2010, will not feel modern, 2010 onwards of vehicles, it still feels like something. When you get in today, you don't feel like you're getting in something really old. Difficult to distinguish that if you're not someone that hangs around classic cars a lot. It's difficult for me to sort of put that into words, but some classic vehicles you get in and they feel like they belong in a different world, different generation of car, just a different generation of people and a world. And if you're younger and you're coming into this, it can be quite stark how that feels when you get into them. And they're quite charming in that way, but charming doesn't usually get people's pennies out of their pockets. The X308 does that though. So this would be, if we're looking at all the generations across, this is one of those picks for me. I like it with any of the engines, any of the specs, and fortunately, they're just in that space where there's enough of them left that they're just still in the sort of depreciation curve, sort of near the bottom end of it. It's not like when you get to the old classic ones and they've all had to be rebuilt, and so rarity is sort of pushing the price back up again, and a bit of demand as well, of people wanting to visit that era. This sort of sits in a time where it's an era that's still recent enough that people don't need to revisit it if they're wanting to get something that maybe their dad had or their granddad had. At the same time, they don't need the huge rebuilding for the most part that some of the old stuff needs. And if you want to drive them every day, they have modern enough reliability. Okay. So yeah, X308. Again, you've got the top models, and there's nothing against having a top model in these. It's just that you can get something mid-spec and it will feel quite special. So that's probably what I would do. Let's move on to where we get into now late generation Jaguars, 2003. And this generation, it doesn't feel classic anymore. It just feels current but older. So X350 comes in, X356, X358. It's two facelifts. They're trying to keep up with the fast-moving world around this car. So 2003, till 2006, 2006, 2007 was a run, then 2008, 2009 facelift again. So what's there to note? There's a diesel that comes in on this first generation. The body is 40% lighter. There is a new bunch of engines. This is where the XJ kind of it meets the modern world, if you like, in the way of there is a high acceptance of competitors are out there and they've captured their market. And the XJ has been struggling to do that. It's been catching people for a generation, then losing them, then they're coming back for a generation. And the X308 has done a great job of sort of retaining some people back. And it's the X350's job to say, okay, you've had your car for 3-4 years now, come and get our new one. And they're doing it with not only a variety of engines, but by expanding the specification. There's still a Vandenpla. I've written it down for this one. It's Jaguar XJ6, XJ8, Jaguar Vandenpla, XJR, XJ Super V8, Daimler, Daimler Super 8, production run 85,000. So a lot of them. But 3 litre, a 3.5, a 4.2, a 4.2 supercharged, and a 2.6 diesel engine, which is it's the Ford PSA compromise, if you like, between them. So it's in Land Rover, it's a TDV6. In this 2.7 diesel engine, sort of a compromise because the French want a 2.5, the Jaguar Land Rover Group want a 3 litre, compromise on a 2.7. Later on, they make it a 3 litre for Jaguar. And this is all sort of under Ford's ownership, and that's why you get these engines come in. But the the 3 litre, it's not the AJ30 engine. It does enough. I think there's a very good Top Gear review. I think it's when James May has just joined Top Gear, and he actually takes one of these out. And he says, it's the first one where you can accept that you've got a few blank buttons and just put your foot down a little bit harder and you can feel like the boss because the boss has got the sort of Super 8 or something like that. And I'm tempted to agree with him. I used to see less of these on the used market, on the classic market. Used to see them in the used market though. I have to say that I was quite young at the time and they didn't really capture me as much as some of the old ones because they didn't have the charm of the older car. They were the current one, and as much as they were a real advancement from the point of view of used, they were a real advancement compared to the generations that had come before. It just at that time they had really stiff competition. Now, does that make them bad cars? Absolutely not. This is if the XJ308 is the classic one to buy, if you're looking at used and you can't quite get yourself into the latest XJs, then I would probably look at facelift. You can go first facelift or second facelift. But if you can go X356 model with a V8 in it, that'd be great. But if you've got to go 6-cylinder, that's absolutely fine too. Diesels, they're right in that period at the moment where if you live in Europe, they're probably being banned in cities. So a little bit more difficult for you to run around in all the time. However, by far and away the most efficient, and they do not feel like slow cars. So the diesel in these, as much as people looked down at them a little bit at the time because you could start with a 3 litre 6-cylinder if you went petrol, you had to go for a 2.7 V6 diesel if you wanted diesel. That compromise isn't what you think it would be without having driven them. And so if it's something you want to keep and you don't have to worry too much about emission laws and you have the diesel offered, you can have a look at the diesel. For everyone else though, inline 6 is fine, V8 better, no surprise there, supercharged one if you can, but I would probably look away from the very first year of production, only because there's enough out there, there's enough still in existence for you to be able to get a deal on whichever one sort of catches your attention the most. From a point of view of styling and from the point of view of driving on the road, they feel fast. Yeah, as I say, even that smaller engine, because they're so light and because they are bigger. And this is kind of where, I said early on about this issue with manufacturers saying, well, our car actually is this competitor or this competitor, and the public not quite getting it because it's like, well, you haven't priced it like that, or it's not quite the size, or you've priced it high, but it doesn't fit into the segment very well, Jaguar here are kind of saying, this is a big car, this is a light car, and this can compete with the best of what the rest of the world has to offer. And they are right in this generation. So, if you've been waiting for me to talk about this one, I know a few of you are waiting for the buyer's guide as well, and I will get to it on this. But the critical point is that there's enough modern aspects that come into this generation of vehicle, 6-speed gearbox comes in as well, that make them good, long cruisers. They make them viable options to just still have as an everyday car. But if you want one to keep long term, you can buy it today and just keep it. And if you keep it nice, it shouldn't need a huge amount of work because it had that more modern engineering done to it. However, if it has a problem, then it's going to be, I would say, a bigger cost in some ways because it has a lot of complexity to it, and there's a lot of modern tech, modern electricals that come into this vehicle. If things go wrong, they go wrong. And there's something I want to bring up just before we jump onto the X351. That design was particularly special for Jaguar. It went in through several design studies, and it's become quite iconic within Jaguar's timeline. It brought enough of the previous historic aspects of the Jaguar brand, whilst also bringing in a lot of modern techniques to designing it. And what they ended up with is something that is different to what Mercedes and to BMW were offering in that early 2000s period. And I think that's probably why, from a point of view, if you're out there and you're thinking to yourself, well, yeah, I want the best XJ that I can get, which is the best in this generation. And I've said, well, you can go for the diesel if you want, but even the sort of smaller inline six is fine. You're thinking, oh, that doesn't really answer my question. Should I just get a supercharged one? If you want. But the point on that generation is the looks of it, the design of it, and the way it drives mean that, unlike in previous generations where getting the right engine was a little bit more important for, say, reliability or for power or for whatever else, in that generation, just the style of it, finding one that's clean and has been kept in really nice condition, it makes the drive, it makes the ownership. And some of you will know what I mean when I say that. Let your sort of nose lead you on that one a little bit. So, now we go on to the X351 generation, the last generation, the one everyone wants to talk about. And you go 3 litre supercharged, 5 litre supercharged, 5 litre and 3 litre diesel engine. And I'm just going to talk about 3 litres. Now, there is a buyer's guide to this car, so if you want a huge amount of details, you can find the buyer's guide. If you want a 3 litre diesel, the advantage you're going to have is if you can buy them in 2015 onwards, and they'll be Euro 6 compliant. So if you live in a country that had the diesel option, but has now gone from governments telling you to buy them and giving you all the incentives of them, and then telling you, no, you can't have them anymore because we made a mistake, and so you have to pay for it, you can get a 2015 model, and you'll have an engine that's compliant. So that's a critical thing because the diesel engine makes these cars quite affordable. It's put in a lot of Land Rover vehicles, it's well known, it's well understood, and there is a known issue with the 2.7 and the 3 litre of crank failures, but that happens a lot more in Land Rovers than it does in Jaguars, probably because of a lighter body. But there is also, if you pull the diesel engine out of a Jaguar and you pull the engine out of a Land Rover, the ancillaries, the way the setup of the engine actually is different between the Jaguar and the Land Rover, because Land Rover have to set up the engine to be able to take a little bit more off-roading, and they have to sort of plumb it in slightly differently into the chassis of Land Rover. So from what I can see, and this is just anecdotal, you're not as at risk going for a diesel engine in the Jaguar. So that's the diesel put off to the side. The 3 litre V6 engine, the AJ6, V6, that's a good engine. It's a good one to buy. Would I go for it? I'd probably try and get a V8, because why not? But in all seriousness, no. I mean, if you go for the V6, you'll be quite happy with it. The problem is that specification is linked to engine on a lot of these, and with the V6, you may find that you just can't get the specification that you want on it. So that's something to be aware. If you go for the V8 model, especially if you go supercharged V8, you can have, by anyone's standard, you can have a car that's modern, that has good representation for what Jaguar were trying to do all along with the XJ in this market. And because it's made, they were kind of made up until officially it's kind of up to 2020, but they were still producing them really into 21, and then you can get some 22 model years, some very last of the run, especially if you're in the UK, because there were government orders that then got cancelled, got moved around, whatever else the story may be. And so you can get really, really recent ones of them. And a lot of them would have carried the diesel engine, actually, if they're those type. But if not, then they had to be a V8, because that's where the specification was. You can get them as a Sentinel if you want a body armoured one, but not that easy to find. And because Jaguar were so keen to try and find, a US market, but a growing Chinese market that had sort of evolved very, very quickly and had brought in a lot of new money to the market that just wasn't there 20 years ago, Jaguar have to make a bigger vehicle. They offer it in a long wheelbase as well. And they bring to market something that otherwise probably should have been what the XJ was all along. This sort of larger, imposing Jaguar that it kind of was in the X350, X308, and then sort of you go right back to the Series 1, Series 2, and into Series 3. But it has this sort of period where finally they bring everything back, and finally they get the money to do what they want, and finally they get the money to put a proper sized chassis underneath it as well, because they're going to do some chassis sharing technology with Land Rover, and that means that they get to put everything underneath this car. So one standout point actually is that the 5 litre gets slung around the Nürburgring. They do a 575 model, but it proves itself around a racetrack as well. Should this car be doing that? Probably not. But the fact that it could go out there and say, yes, there's AMG Mercedes models, yes, there's the sort of V12 7 Series is still around, but if you want speed and you want prestige and you want something that not everyone else has got, then you buy a Jaguar. And that's what this last generation Jaguar does. There are loads of details in this model in the buyer's guide, so I won't go into the sort of the finer aspects of it. But what I would say is that the supercharged AJ V6 seems to have fallen in most markets in sort of a middle gap, because in the US you could have a V8, supercharged V8. A lot of the market sort of didn't pay too much attention to then the V6. In Europe, you had the diesel V6, which got most of the market, and if people wanted a petrol, they went for the more powerful supercharged V8. So it kind of split the market, and the V6 didn't get a lot of the market in between it. And because of this, really, you're going to be making a choice. Should you go for the diesel? Should you go for the high power V8? If you're buying sort of 09, 10, 11, I'd probably be looking at a V8. If you're looking very late on, and it's going to be Euro 6 emissions compliant, I'd be probably looking at a diesel, especially because after about 2017, it's very difficult actually to find the V8s if you're outside of the US. And in the US, the market supply drops off massively anyway. So, and they do a 575 model R. To be honest, the XJR in this generation, it's fantastic if you want something that is a uber fast, uber sized saloon. But I don't know. I think a regular supercharged one has something a little bit more about it than those R's that are really sort of hot to trot versions. Now that might be a little bit between a few different opinions, and that's fine. But that's what I would say on that one. It's just that they're difficult to find. That is the whole Jaguar XJ range. I know I would have missed something. There'll be details in there. It's very difficult with Jaguar because it's such a long period of time, but I hope it's giving you a highlight throughout the generations. If you've enjoyed it, consider adding a like and maybe adding a subscribe so you can see future videos like this. And have a very good day. I shall see you in the next one.